So, welcome everybody and Shabbat Shalom. The first two chapters, right, the first two Oneg programs of our 50th anniversary year have shown how taking a risk, taking the first steps to creating a gay synagogue in New York set the stage for what CBST has become today. The commitment of volunteers, lay leaders, and others to build a foundation that is truly remarkable in Jewish history and in our history. As we enter chapter 3, we arrive at an era of incredible sadness. And we zoom in a little closer. The first two chapters, we got, big general history. We learned about the leaders. Now we're zooming in a little closer tonight. We learn how CBST became a vital lifeline and its members crucial in the world of AIDS activism. Though it was a time for substantial organizing and a fight that changed the world, we don't romanticize it, and we don't romanticize the work that was forced truly upon the gay and lesbian community as it was known then. But we can be deeply proud of this work. And we're deeply grateful to CBST member and past president Bill Hibsher for telling just a small part of your story tonight, for shedding light on some of the most difficult times of your life and of our collective history.
As I mentioned in the service itself, the goal of our various celebrations of our anniversary is to engage in a conversation. And my dream is for that to be a multi-generational conversation, to really acknowledge the ways that the world is different today than it was when the events of this book took place, but also there's deep, obvious wisdom to learn from those times, and to make sure we're doing the deep work as a congregation of engaging with each other. And so each of these Friday nights, as you know, we're recording it. It'll become part of our history itself. And as Cantor Rosen said, this is the third month of the year and the third chapter. And the book is not in chronological order strictly. The first two chapters, as Cantor Rosen said, are at the very beginnings, but then the chapters become more thematic. And this is the first of those thematic chapters focusing on the impact of AIDS. This poster here is a photograph of our first AIDS quilt, and you can see it was done in 1993. And these were the men who had died at CBST up until 1993. As I said, we're talking about the years from 1981 to roughly 1997-ish, that AIDS was absolutely a death sentence. And there was the only rare survivor, and we're going to talk more about that. There are those who made it through to 1997 and then were able to live with the help of the therapies that existed. But I wanted this conversation to be between these two men. I love both of them very, very much. I learned from each of them many deep things. I wanted them to know each other, and because Bill Hibsher, I met very early on, and I think, Bill, you're going to tell the story tonight, how we met? Maybe, maybe not. I met in the first year I was here at CBST, and then in 1995, when I was trying to create the Mishkan Development Committee, which was to create a committee to considering whether we should considering going for a building of our own. Irving Cooperberg and I spoke about who would lead that effort. And Irving Cooperberg said to me, there are only two people in the entire New York City gay community about whom everybody has complete respect. And in order to make this a successful effort, those two people have to chair this project. And the community then was, of course, extremely fractious and extremely divided. And those two people were Marcy Kahn and Bill Hibsher. And because Marcy was a judge, she wasn't able to be involved in fundraising, of course. So that entirely fell on Bill Hibsher's shoulders. And Bill led us through a very long process, starting in 1995, resulting in our moving into this building in 2016. That is because of Bill Hibsher's leadership. Bill is a lawyer, and most recently a lawyer. His bio was in our Shabbat program. became our CBST board president in 2012 to 2013, having served on the board for many years before that. And then he recently retired after almost 50 years as a practicing lawyer, most recently as a partner at Bryan Cave, Leighton and Paisner? Leighton Paisner. I only knew it as Bryan Cave. When did the other two guys add? Yeah, okay. Before that, he was an assistant U.S. attorney where he headed the Civil Rights Unit in Manhattan, and he served on the boards of Lambda Legal, Hetrick Martin Institute, Public Health Solutions, Gender Family Project, and was a member of the New York City Human Rights Commission. He's a recipient of Lifetime Achievement Awards from Lambda, Hetrick Martin, Family Equality Council, and Legal. Bill and his partner, Richard Orient, who I also know for all of these many, many years, and Richard chairs the CBST Art Committee, which you might not know about, but Richard is the one person who's allowed to decide what goes on the walls of this building, and nothing can go on a wall that Richard doesn't approve, and Richard doesn't frame, actually. So I'm delighted to have both of you here tonight. I know you watch a lot online, and the two of them are so important to me personally. And this conversation of exploring AIDS and its impact couldn't have a better person than you, Bill, helping to navigate this conversation. And I'm thrilled that Cantor Rosen, and as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that those of us who are older don't always recognize, and I'm very sensitive to that because I work with the interns all the time and younger people at CBST, is what it means to come of age sexually before AIDS existed, which was true for me and for many of the people here of my generation, and what it means for people like Cantor Rosen and all of younger people for whom coming of age sexually means AIDS. It is a part of the universe. That's a dividing line that we don't always understand the deep and profound implications, in both directions, by the way. And the ability to learn from each other is a profound one. You'll notice here, as Cantor Rosen mentioned, CBST was started as the New York's Gay Synagogue. By 1993, it was known as the Lesbian and Gay Synagogue, not yet changed to the LGBTQ Synagogue. So with that, I'm delighted to turn this over to Cantor Rosen to lead the conversation, and then we will open it up to comments, questions from our congregation. Cantor Rosen.
Thank you, Rabbi. And thank you again, Bill, for being with us tonight. So in our discussions, you mentioned joining CBST in 1992, well after the most acute time of AIDS. Can you describe your relationship to CBST, how you heard of CBST, and tell us what encouraged you to join CBST and eventually become a crucial and key member of our community?
Well, first, let me just say that I'm delighted to be here, and Rabbi, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, and thank you, Cantor Rosen, for your diligence and care in helping prepare this program. It's really been an honor to work with you on it. So now to your question. I certainly knew about CBST in the 1980s, and I attended a memorial service for a friend named Mark Turkel in March of 1986 at CBST's Bethune Street facility. Mark was a lawyer, and I knew Mark through my work on the Lambda Legal Defense Fund, as it was then called. Mark was a very generous cooperating attorney with Lambda and did a lot of pro bono work for the gay community. Coincidentally, Mark Turkel went to law school with my late partner, Bill Johnson. So when Bill and I got together and Bill moved to New York, Mark was a very important person in our lives, and he was really the first person that we knew to have died of AIDS. But CBST was very much in the ether. There weren't so many lesbian, gay, as it was called, organizations in those years. CBST was formed in '73. Lambda Legal was formed also in '73, the two oldest LGBT organizations. So I knew a lot about CBST. In 1992, Irving Cooperberg, who Rabbi Kleinbaum just mentioned, and who I knew through his work at the LGBT Community Services Center, where he was one of the founders, reached out to me. He had previously reached out to Bill Johnson, who was a tax lawyer, and asked, he and Marcy Kahn, who was also part of the founding of the center, asked Bill Johnson to do the center's tax exemption work, which was somewhat challenging for an LGBT organization, and Bill did it, and we got to know Irving a bit better, and Irving called one day and said, CBST has hired a rabbi, and her installation is happening this weekend, and you and Bill have to be there. I think as Rabbi Kleinbaum knows, I didn't go to synagogues very often in those days. I left Hebrew school. I went to an Orthodox Hebrew school in Brooklyn, and I left Hebrew school when I was 10 years old, abruptly, I will say. And I think that installation of our senior rabbi was the first time I voluntarily went back into a synagogue, other than friends' kids' b'nai mitzvah in all those years. And I listened to this young rabbi speak, and I said to myself, the LGBT movement now has a new, charismatic, and impactful leader, and I was really struck by Rabbi Kleinbaum. Many of you know that within a month of becoming CBST's rabbi, Rabbi Kleinbaum officiated at 4 AIDS funerals, including the funeral of Mel Rosen, who chaired the rabbi search committee that hired her. And within that year, my then partner, Bill Johnson, began to develop symptoms of AIDS. We both knew that we were HIV positive well before 1993, but during that year he got sick. And as he became more ill and it was apparent that he was going to die in the near term, we both reached out to Rabbi Kleinbaum and asked her if she would meet with us to really help both of us through this incredibly difficult time. And that was an interaction that I think really cemented what, for me, has been a lifelong bond with Rabbi Kleinbaum and with the synagogue.
Thank you so much. It's really, it's been interesting to hear about this change in your, we'll hear more about the earlier times, but as you found CBST in such a difficult time and that you're still with us, it means so much to so many people. So maybe you can paint a picture of what it was like to be a gay man in the 1980s, or a little before, and perhaps in New York City and beyond. And in our discussions, you talked about a euphoria in the 1970s that was suddenly upended by an awful disease. And if you can also, you could tell us about how it felt as AIDS began to take hold in earnest.
Well, I was very struck by Shep's remarks earlier this evening during the service, and his experience of coming out in New York felt very much like my own. I too came out, I think also in 1975. I was a bit older than you, Shep, but it was also an extremely traumatic and very celebratory time for me. I had been married to my college sweetheart. I think I knew I was gay from the age of 5, but it took me until I was 27 to actually do something about it. And my wife and I, a very wonderful person, decided that we would have an open marriage. That's very, very current today. We were ahead of our times. And we did that. We did that for 3 years and then realized that that just wasn't who we were. And so we went our separate ways. And I moved into gay New York City in 1970s. And though I was 30 years old, I really began my adolescence at that moment. And you know, drugs, sex, and rock and roll was very much the theme. I was also beginning as a young lawyer at a law firm in Manhattan, so there's a lot going on in my life. But I was making friends. I was meeting people that I never would have met if I had not come out as a gay person. I was meeting people from different parts of the country, different occupations, diverse people. And I was just celebrating it all, and I was partying like hell. And then in the early 80s, I think those of you who have read chapter 3 of the book know that the drum roll started slowly, and we started hearing more and more about the gay cancers and the gay illnesses, and then we started seeing people get sick. And we started seeing people get very sick. earlier during the service, we heard a lot about the current epidemic, the epidemic that we've all lived through, and the similarities between the COVID epidemic and AIDS. And there are many similarities, the fear, the illness, hospitals being, overstretched. All of that was going on during AIDS. And the numbers are not that different. The number of people who died of AIDS is not that much lower than the 1.1 million that I think is the current number for COVID deaths in the US. But the stark difference is that AIDS was surgical. AIDS attacked a specific community. It seemed like AIDS was only infecting gay men in New York City and San Francisco for a while. Now we know it affected other communities as well, but Rabbi Kleinbaum just said that 40% of CBST's members died of AIDS. So for someone who had just come out after really a life of torture, of dealing with my identity and finding myself and celebrating that, to suddenly be in an environment where our very lovemaking is what makes us sick and kills so many of us, it felt like just like a huge bad joke.
Thank you for starting to bring us into that pain. And I know, as we discussed, it's not always the time in your life that you want to think about, but it's really important for not only myself, but people of my generation and everybody here and everybody on Zoom to be able to have you open up for us.
Well, I appreciate your saying that. I think that Cantor Rosen knows that our discussions in preparation for today were not easy discussions for me, and going back into the details have really been has been quite painful. But I think remembering that time, remembering that epidemic is really important. We at CBST have this memorial board in the back of the room. We have this image of the quilt. We have our Yiska service, a Yom Kippur, every year, in which we read the names of all CBST members who have died. And a few years ago, a young person came up to me after the Yiska service and said, I was listening to the names of CBST's past members who have died, and I look around the room at the Javits Center, and it seems like a fairly gender equal crowd, and yet the vast majority of the names read were the names of men. And this was someone who was about 30 years old, educated, and it became so obvious to me that this story about our history and this epidemic just needs to be told. And so I'm really delighted that we in New York have the AIDS Memorial Park across the street from what had been St. Vincent's Hospital, the epicenter of the epidemic. And the AIDS Memorial Park administrators do a great deal of programming, and it's just a wonderful place for us to kind of go to be a site to remember. So, thanks.
While we were discussing the various parts of both your story and also the book, something that came out that was really, as a Jewish historian myself, it enriches me to hear about the vital change that occurred between the relationship of gay men and lesbians during this time. And it was during the most acute part of the AIDS crisis. You described lesbians as caregivers. That was the word that you used. And you also mentioned the work to create gender parity on boards within organizations like Lambda Legal, fighting for same-sex rights. And I would love if you could share what you shared with me about how that evolved and your reflections on that relationship.
So as you know from my bio, I worked at the Justice Department. In 1982, when I left the Justice Department, I was now able to get more involved in some of the political activity that I was really wanting to get more involved in. And I joined the board of Lambda Legal. And Lambda Legal was one of the few organizations in the LGBT community that had a gender parity board, this equal number of men, equal number of women. It was quite a challenge to find women who were qualified and who would serve on the board. I mean, women, lesbians in those days, had so many other issues that they were dealing with in the workplace, just as women. And, but they did the job, and we had an incredible gender-balanced board at Lambda. And I think lesbians and gay men understood that joining together, joining forces, was going to be impactful in this civil rights movement of ours. But I think it's fair to say that it was an arranged marriage in those days. And as I've read the earlier chapters of our book, I realized that there were tensions between men and women at CBST in the early days. And then AIDS came. And AIDS did not impact lesbians very much, if at all. But lesbians really did become caregivers. They really did step up and take care of gay men who they knew and gay men who they didn't know. And I think that transition, that event, really cemented the relationship between gay men and lesbians in a very positive way. There are probably other things that came out of the AIDS epidemic that are positive. You think about some of the initiatives that activists in the medical community brought about in terms of patient care and community-based drug trials, and just insisting that patients have more of a say in what happens in the progress of new drugs. Organizations came about, that some of which continue to exist today, many of which are here in New York, that have done profound work in the area of AIDS and in other areas as well. So it wasn't just a completely horrible, sad story. Good things came out of it, and makes me think of your sermon, Rabbi, tonight about, good things that can come out of horrible things.
That reminds me of, you were speaking, we talked, so in the book, we hear about Larry Kramer's instrumental building of the GMHC, the Gay Men's Health Crisis. You mentioned the lack of agency among people with AIDS, and there was a vacuum sort of filled by nonprofit organizations. And we also heard about events that brought out the best in people. You mentioned the Madison Square Garden event. Tell us about maybe a little bit of other parts that brought out the best in people. Like Rabbi said, Gamzu Latova, but we only see that in retrospect.
Well, the Madison Square Garden event was really an extraordinary, I guess it was a fundraiser. I think it was for GMHC, and it occurred quite early on. Was it 1986 or?
I don't have it written down, but
okay, I have it written down in my notes, but I won't struggle to find it. It was tens of thousands of people, and it was one of these gala events that we in the LGBT community are invited to attend, often twice a month. But in those days, there were none. This was the first, and this was really a fabulous event. And there was Leonard Bernstein leading the orchestra in Madison Square Garden, and this was a gay event. And we looked around the entire garden, and we saw all these people, and we realized how powerful we were and how much impact we really could have. So that was a sort of a symbolic first event in that time. But when we think about organizations like ACT UP and the pressures that it brought to bear on government agencies to do the right thing, and so many other organizations as well around the country, those are some of the dividends of this horrible disease.
Thank you. Speaking about organizations, it goes without saying, really, that healthcare and the search for care in general for people with AIDS could be its own course in a university. You describe doctors in the gay community as on the front line, and I think thinking about our current pandemic, that the healthcare community really, they were on the front line, they are on the front line, they are the essential workers. Many of them did contract AIDS and died, but you also had a direct impact on this from a legal standpoint, and I'd like to explore that now for us to all learn about. It's in the book, so I will be quoting from the book now. As a new member of Lambda Legal Defense Fund's Board of Directors in 1983, Bill Hibsher, and his law firm represented Dr. Joseph Sonnabend, a prominent New York City doctor who had many AIDS patients, in the first AIDS-related discrimination case that went to the New York state courts, perhaps in any court in the US. In 1983, when there was much panic and little information about AIDS, the Co-op apartment building, where Dr. Sonnabend had his office, refused to renew his lease because they were unhappy having PWAs, that's people with AIDS, coming into the building. And Bill's firm teamed with Attorney General Bob Abrams to persuade the court to order the co-op to allow Dr. Sonnabend to remain. So I'd love for you to tell us how you became involved in the case and the implications of your success.
Well, I met Dr. Mathilde Krim at some point through my work at Lambda. And for those of you who don't know, Dr. Krim was a biologist, a researcher on interferon at Rockefeller University. And she was also married to Arthur Krim, who is the president of Orion Films. And Arthur was a major advisor to President Johnson. In fact, Mathilde and Arthur had a house on LBJ's ranch in Texas. So Mathilde Krim really had access to power, and she was a scientist. And when AIDS started bubbling up, she understood that she had to harness the unique context that she had to fight this disease. And she began an organization called, what was it called? Originally, it became AMFAR. We all know it as AMFAR. And one day she called me and said that the medical director of what is now called AMFAR, Joseph Sonnabend, had some personal legal issues that she would like me to work with him on. And I said, sure. And I met Dr. Sonnabend. Joseph Sonnabend was unlike many of the other doctors who were mostly treating gay men in the village. Sonnabend had studied in South Africa and the United Kingdom. He was Rhodesian by birth, and he was an infectious disease researcher. He had really been a professor for many years, and then came to the United States in 1980 when he was about 50 years old and opened a small medical practice in Greenwich Village, New York, where most of his patients were gay men who presented with sexually transmitted diseases. Sonnabend had many colleagues in New York City, other doctors who conducted similar practices, but very few who had his expertise in infectious disease. So when Sonnabend's patients and other doctors' patients started presenting with these rare illnesses, with Kaposi sarcoma and pneumocystis pneumonia, Sonnabend knew that something was happening, and he immediately began collecting bloods from his patients and sent those bloods to a university medical center that he established a relationship with, so that those bloods could be studied at such time as information started to present itself. So in the course of representing Sonnabend about this very amusing business issue that he was dealing with, he one day told me that I think that's a telephone, right? Hope that's not my phone.
No, it's not.
Okay, thank you. He told me that the co-op board in which his medical practice was located in the building, co-op board that ran the building, told him that they would not allow him to continue his medical practice in the building because he was treating people with AIDS. Now, as a lawyer, I know that when you do something discriminatory, you don't announce it, but people were quite brazen about AIDS discrimination, and he asked me if there was anything that I thought I could do. I was on the Lambda board, so I was well suited to think about it, but the fact was that there were no laws protecting people with AIDS. There was nothing that prevented the co-op board from discriminating against the doctor because he was treating patients with AIDS, but we decided to pursue it anyway, and with Lambda as our kind of front lawyer, my law firm took the case on and managed to persuade New York's Attorney General, as Cantor Rosen mentioned, to join us in this lawsuit, which it turned out was not only the first lawsuit in New York, but the first lawsuit in the country to argue that people with AIDS were entitled to protection under the law. The theory of the case was that handicapped persons laws should protect people with AIDS. And one of our concerns as lawyers was that Joseph Sonnabend, who was the doctor who was being kicked out of his office, was not himself a person with AIDS. So we decided to name a couple of his patients. And if we had some plaintiffs in the case who were themselves people with AIDS, then we could claim the handicap discrimination protection that we were hoping to establish as a rule of law. So the patient that stepped forward to be the plaintiff was none other than Michael Callan. Now, some of you may remember Michael, but many of you know the Callan Lord Institute, the clinic that's located in Chelsea, that is named in Michael's memory. So Michael became a plaintiff as well, and the case was filed, and it was assigned to Supreme Court Justice Ira Gamerman. Now, when I heard that Gamerman got the case, I was kind of delighted. I thought, okay, this is a bit beschert, because Gamerman was one of the very few judges who attended the Lambda annual dinner. So I thought, well, okay, this is a very good sign. We had a conference with the judge, and I was on the subway platform going home after the conference, and the lawyer who represented the co-op happened to be someone who I knew. He had some relationship with a partner at my firm. I had met him, and he came up to me on the subway platform. He said, "Bill, do you realize that this doctor is treating people with AIDS?" And I realized that there wasn't going to be a lot that I could say at that moment, and I said, yes, I realized that. But it was emblematic of the kind of overt discrimination that existed in those days. We hired an infectious disease expert to act as our expert witness during the case to establish that AIDS was not casually transmissible. Unlike COVID, AIDS was not something that you could get via casual contact, and therefore, the people in the co-op had nothing to fear in the event that they passed someone in the lobby who was going into Dr. Sonnabend's office. And this doctor, who was a pretty eminent infectious disease doctor, our expert, told us that at a department meeting, the chair of his department, I won't name the hospital, the chair of his department referred to AIDS as the wrath of God disease. And that gives you a sense of the level of bigotry and license that people felt they had to discriminate against gays. People were talking about quarantine in those days. So we went before Justice Gamerman, and Justice Gamerman issued what essentially was the first decision in the United States establishing that people with AIDS were in fact protected by the handicap discrimination laws, and he issued an injunction preventing the co-op from terminating Dr. Sonnabend's lease.
Yeah. And I think we're all in acknowledgement of how brilliant that is. And it really changed the world. So another round of applause for this.
I should say that after the case ended, Michael Callan, who's quite a character, he and Sonnabend started People with AIDS Coalition and did a lot of AIDS education, very often very unpopular in the gay male community because they were advocating safe sex. And gay men in those days really didn't want to hear that. So Joe Sonnabend and Michael Callan were really criticized far and wide. He also had a wonderful a cappella band called The Flirts. I recommend the CDs if you've never heard it. He was quite, The Flirtations, but in short, they referred to themselves as The Flirts, which I like.
Insider information.
And after the case was over, Bill Johnson and I had a little celebratory dinner at our apartment with Michael and his partner and Joe Sonnabend and a couple of others. And after the dinner, Michael said to me, "Do you need a secretary?" And it turned out that, in fact, I did need a secretary. And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, I'm out of a job and I can type and I'd like to be your secretary." So Michael became the fastest typist that anyone ever met at my law firm. He became a secretary at the law firm. And so my partners and I had this marvelous conversation about whether we were morally required to tell the other staff members at the law firm that we had just hired a person with AIDS. And we decided we had just done this case. AIDS is not casually transmissible. Why create the hysteria when we really didn't think we had the moral obligation? So we hired Michael. And a number of our support staff were very conservative individuals, many of whom lived in New Jersey. I'm not casting aspersions on New Jersey. And we weren't certain what would happen with Michael in this environment. Well, within a week, Michael had the other secretaries in the office reading lesbian radical literature. And a month or so later, Life magazine did a whole display on Michael Callan working at our law firm. And the other secretaries would come up to me and say, "Isn't it marvelous that Michael is in this magazine?" At some point, CBS News did a news program on Michael Callan. They came to our office to film him working as a secretary. And when the camera people learned that the subject of this piece was a person with AIDS, they refused to proceed. They just stopped the job right there. And the producer got on the phone with her boss, and her boss said to the producer that he should tell the cameraman that if they don't proceed, they're fired. They don't have to report back to the office. And then they had a big conversation. I assume they had a union. They talked to their union and realized that there was just no basis on which they could refuse to proceed with the shoot. So the shoot went on, and Michael was on TV, and that was not nearly enough fame for Michael. He got plenty more.
Thank you. Before I invite the rabbi to give a little closing context before questions, I want to turn everybody, if you haven't looked at the book, I want to point out one piece of the book. It's really subtle. In chapter 3, it's the use of space that Rabbi Cohen put in for the memoriams. So they appear, there are little memorials throughout the chapter that appear at various lengths. Some are just a few sentences, some are longer. The first being listed from February 1982. As the chapter moves along, the memorial inserts become more and more pronounced until all that is left are memorials. The narrative completely drops away, and we are left with a reality of incredible sadness and loss in our community. And it's difficult, almost impossible, to list all the CBST members who died of AIDS, though, as has been said tonight, it's understood to be about 40% of the male congregants. It's not a complete list, but we also read that Rabbi Cohen noted the first AIDS-related prayer was introduced at CBST's Friday night service in 1984. It began with the words, "Dear God, our community is afflicted, and we know not why." Nearly 40 years ago, we now know why. We now know the devastation that was then a mystery. And may all of their names and the names that are not listed, the names in our hearts and the names we don't know, so many countless names, may they be a blessing for us and for all who come after. Amen. Amen. So thank you, Bill, and I'll invite the rabbi for...
Well, thank both of you so much. A round of applause for both of you. That was so moving. And definitely worth, if you don't know the Flirtations and Michael Callan's singing, really worth going on YouTube. Unfortunately, those videos from those days weren't so good but to capture Michael Callan, I did not know that story, Bill. That's amazing about him becoming your secretary. But he then, of course, did die from AIDS, and so Callan Lord is named in part, as Bill mentioned, for Michael Callan. And I want to just say something to finish a little bit of the story that you started about how we met, and such a deep, deep connection. When I first went over to their home, and Bill Johnson was at that time very, very sick and not going to live very long, and his name was Bill Johnson. He was very eager for me to know that he was Jewish. He was quite blonde and fair-skinned, but he said to Bill Hibsher while he's lying there dying. I mean, it was really very soon after that he passed. He ended up dying on World AIDS Day. His funeral was on World AIDS Day. But he told he was giving Bill Hibsher instructions about looking through his drawers to find his bar mitzvah certificate from Temple Emeth in Teaneck, New Jersey, to what? It was the Teaneck Jewish Center. Yeah, and to make sure that I knew that he was Jewish. It was so important to him. And I just love the image. Yes, and Sue Canrich is here and a member of CBST. You know.
And Sue is Bill's sister, and I think of Sue as my sister. And for many years, Sue and her late mother joined the synagogue shortly after Bill died, in part because the rabbi of the synagogue in which Bill was bar mitzvah in Teaneck, New Jersey, refused to pay a shiva call because Bill had died of AIDS. Now that may seem incredible, but that was really not so unusual. But good comes from bad. I inherited a sister. How lucky am I?
Sue has been a member of CBST. And Sue, and you've been a member of CBST for how many years now? Coming on trip, you came on our last trip to Israel, so around that time, yes. Sure, we're going to open this up. So Sue, you get to. Your
father was at the Y in Hackensack. Actually, my father and your father played handball together. He was head of the youth program when I was a youth.
So Sue's comment about that reminds me of a particular sadness about the AIDS epidemic, and that is, for many gay men, the first time they came out to their parents was on their deathbeds. And imagine you're dying of AIDS and your parents don't even know that you're gay, and you have to tell them, A, that you're gay, and B, that you're dying of this gay disease. Just really, really awful. And so the story about the rabbi not coming to the shiva is an example of how some parents behaved. Many parents embraced their children and wondered why they hadn't been told earlier. Some parents rejected their children and refused to let them come home during that time. So the horrors are innumerable during the period of AIDS.
And CBST played a big role in many of those. There were situations, and many of you remember these, where there were 2 funerals for somebody who died because the legal next of kin was never a partner, of course, because there was no legal marriage. So the legal next of kin, even if somebody had a long-term partner, it wasn't legal, and the parents would sometimes swoop in, and understandably devastated, and sometimes exactly as Bill described, finding out their son was gay at the same time that he's dying of AIDS. And they would do a funeral in their home synagogues where it would be never mentioned that they were gay or that they died from AIDS, or that a partner existed if there was a partner, or that a community or who they were. And CBST would do a second funeral, but we would never have the body in those situations, where we would do a memorial service so that the truth of the whole life could be acknowledged. And I did 4 of those in those years, kind of second funerals without the body, because the families took over for the funeral. In one situation, we had a young man in the hospital. We had the family in the hallway dealing with the fact they're Orthodox, finding out that their son was gay, and just really upset. There was one sister of the young man knew about him and was accepting, and the whole family was outside not. And I was trying very hard they wouldn't even talk to me because I was gay also, so it was this was a great example. They were from what's the synagogue on the Upper East Side, the Orthodox synagogue? Lookstein's synagogue? KJ. It was KJ synagogue. Lookstein did the funeral, didn't mention that he was gay at all, that he died from AIDS, and we did but I just have such a strong image of the family being in the hallway and just completely wiping out the reality of this young man's life. And his sister ended up starting a fund to raise money to do consciousness raising in the Orthodox community. But as Bill describes, I mean, the Jewish funeral homes here in New York would not let a person with AIDS body come into the funeral home unless it was entirely in one of those plastic bags, and they wouldn't let them do regular tahara and Jewish ritual practices. And I only had one or two rabbi friends here in New York who would fight that fight with me. There were very, very few rabbis, and it was the Jewish community was very slow at opening up to really dealing with AIDS. It's really a shanda. It ultimately came around, and now, the reform movement is very proud of what it did, and the Reconstructionists, and at the time, they were all terrible, all terrible. The one other great rabbi in New York around AIDS issues was Marshall Meyer at BJ. He was really a real supporter of mine, and really a really visible presence out there in the world in those early times. Okay, so let's open it up to questions or comments. And Michael, you just have to use this so folks on Zoom can.
This is a comment, and I don't know that it requires much of a response, but one of the things that's really been getting me over the last couple of months with what's happening in so many of the states is it's deja vu for what AIDS was a reason to vilify gay men. Now we have drag and grooming and all this other non-existent things, and it's the same vilification all over again, and it's scary as all hell.
Yeah.
Really, any comment? Let's just get a few more comments. We'll go around.
Hi. What a great talk. Thank you both, and thanks, Rabbi, for the space. As I was sitting here listening, Bill...
You stand up that way, just people on Zoom will be able to see.
Okay, sure. Where do you want me? Right here? Okay, all right, thanks.
Stage manager.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
Multitask.
We've known each other a long time. I think, I first came to CBST, it was more than a decade ago. And I think that's around the time that we met. And so I remember my first service, it was Rosh Hashanah, and watching the blessing of the children. And it was like so shocking for me. I could be Jewish and have a family and kids and, this whole thing. But you've seen the synagogue evolve in such a major, beautiful way. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I've already been outed as someone who only joined the synagogue in 1992. That's a mere 31 years ago, and there were 20 actually pretty marvelous years that preceded that time. In reading the book, I was struck by the incredible community of learned volunteers, caring volunteers, who built the synagogue as it was. Rabbi Kleinbaum mentioned earlier that in 1995, she asked me and Marcy Kahn to co-chair the Mishkan committee because Bethune Street was actually too small for the Friday night service. That was a good problem to have, and we surveyed the city to find an appropriate venue for a Friday night service, and without taking the time to provide the details, the best site was the Church of the Holy Apostles, an Episcopal church on 9th Avenue, which would make itself available to us. That church had had a fire some years earlier, a devastating fire, and so it was completely rebuilt, and most of the Christian iconography, which had been lost in the fire, was not rebuilt. It was air-conditioned, had a good sound system. It was perfect, and it turns out that Church of the Holy Apostles on 9th Avenue was where CBST had its very first service in 1973. That was like, we didn't know that as we were zeroing in on these various sites. And so we came back to the community and we presented the church and all of the positives that it would provide. It's convenient, subway location, etc. And there was really a civil war at the synagogue. People were extremely upset at the idea that we would suggest that we would have Shabbat services in a church. And we sort of had to deal with that over a number of years. And there was a group of CBST members that decided to have their own minyan, and they conducted Friday night services at Bethune Street in that smaller space, and that went on for a while. But eventually, and I think of this story because of your question, Andrew, about how CBST evolved, eventually we all learned, we all kind of got over some of our prejudices and some of the things that we were afraid of, and came to realize that those fears were really not well-founded. And that group rejoined the larger community. And I think that story can be told in many examples. The hiring of a rabbi. Do we need a rabbi? Read the book and you'll understand how controversial. I won't get ahead of that. But those controversies have been, it's like a family. There have been very healthy controversies for this community. And now here we are. There's this wonderful congregation. I'm delighted at the number of young people that are with us tonight. We're in this pretty beautiful space. So I think CBST has really done well in the mere 3 decades that I've been along for the ride. So.
There is another question over here. Michael Levine, or question or comment.
Thank you, Bill, for a wonderful, wonderful discussion with Cantor Rosen. In the year 2000, when we were still at the Bethune Street location, we did a program bringing together the younger and older members of the congregation to share with each other what the issues were that kept us divided. How could we bring the congregation together? So we older folks said, you know, we have a problem when you use words like queer. We didn't accept that. We knew if we were called queer when we were younger, we would get beaten up in the streets. And the younger kids said to us, you have to understand that we of our generation never knew anyone with AIDS. Look at the memorial board. We don't know a single person on that board who died of AIDS. We agreed at that time that we each, young and old, had a lot to teach each other. Thank you again for a beautiful program.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for a wonderful conversation, and Rabbi, thank you so much. So my question is, when we think about death, sometimes it's unfathomable to think about those that we've lost, and especially in this context, it has even more difficulty for our minds to process. So we learned tonight in the service that, you know, although these difficult moments can happen, we still, you know, hold 2 truths at once, that we, you know, need to remember people, but it also might be difficult. So my question is, and I don't know if anyone in the audience could also probably respond to this, but when we think about, do you have any routines, or have you heard of any routines that you know of for yourself or for people in your lives in, you know, how to commemorate those that we've lost, whether they be people that you know, whether they be people that you don't know? Any advice would be great.
I kind of think this is a rabbi question, and you know, I think about Bill Johnson, my partner who died of AIDS in 1993 and whose funeral occurred on World AIDS Day in 1993. And I think about the Isker service. I think about the memorial board that those of us in this sanctuary can look up and glance at. Think about the AIDS Memorial Park. But then there are all those very personal moments, those personal memories. There are the connections to someone who you loved and who is no longer with you. And in those ways, that person really lives on. And when Bill died, I didn't think that I could live on. But I had a wonderful group of friends who really surrounded me with love and took care of me. And then Richard Orient came into my life. And I came to realize that I could continue, I could move on. And so I don't know if that's a message that provides hope, Max, to people. Perhaps you're experiencing a potential loss in your own life. It's not easy, and there really are no words that I can utter that will give you the game plan. But I have a feeling that you'll find a way and that you will be okay and that most of us will be able to get through it.
Sometime after Bill Johnson died, Bill Hibsher called me. Yes, they were the Bills, if you get the... to ask me if I would visit another friend of his who was dying, Jeffrey Karpels, and his partner, Richard Orient. And I visited Jeffrey also soon before Jeffrey passed, did his funeral, and Bill told me that he and Bill Johnson were best friends with Richard Orient and Jeffrey, and the four men had spent their lives with dinner parties and time together, and were really deeply close. And then I did Jeffrey's funeral. And then sometime after that, Bill asked for an appointment with me. Do you remember that? You sure? And came to meet with me to say, Rabbi, I just need to tell you that Richard and I are together. That these two men who had been with two other men who had died from AIDS had found each other, who had been deep and beautiful, best friends before. And now how many years have you guys been together?
29.
29 years they've been together. And when we did this building, and really, there is no way to say exactly this without saying this. A lot of people were involved in getting this building to happen. A lot of people gave money. A lot of people worked on committees. A lot of people did a lot of the schnorring that's necessary. But there is only one person who's really responsible for it all, and it's Bill Hibsher. And then when we did the room names, Bill and Richard took the room downstairs that we now call the Richard Orient room, the Hibsher Orient room. Sorry, Bill. The Hibsher Orient room. And what I want you to do, Max, is I want you to go down and see what the inscription says when you walk into that room. These two men dedicated that room to their late partners, whose names are up on the wall of the Hibsher Orient room to this day. I think about Bill Johnson, I think about Jeffrey, every time I walk into that room. I walk around, and that's the power of community that takes us way beyond our own individual lives in some way. But I think, Bill, you said it perfectly. It's not easy. You think you can't go on, and then you find a way to do it. And that's the miracle of being a human being.
So Rabbi,
yeah.
I can't resist just observing, we're all familiar with the dynamic of the widows and widowers in Florida who find each other after many, many years of happy or not so happy marriages. And so Richard and I like to describe ourselves as the AIDS widows who have found each other.
Yes.
Hi. I had a different experience because during the acute period of the AIDS crisis, I was a young law student and lawyer in Washington, D.C. So it was a whole different ballgame because there was a lot more governmental fighting going on. And I just wanted to build on something that you said. In New York, the lesbian community, the women were seen as caretakers. But I don't want to underestimate the amount of fight and protest that the women joined with the men in those years. I remember representing a group of protesters, most of which were women. They wrapped themselves up in red tape and called themselves the FDA, and they were actually protesting at the FDA, and they called themselves the Furious Dyke Association. And this was in the time when they were trying to get the red tape of what was going on at the FDA to get drugs approved. I'm going to let it go in a minute, but I just want to state, and what people don't know is that a lot of the problems that happened in the government, which was also in our pandemic, people were afraid of the vaccines and the drugs that came out because they came so fast. Well, what we've learned in the AIDS crisis back then is that the reason why they didn't come so fast is because after a trial was done, after any kind of application was done, it would sit on somebody's desk for a year or two before they even got to look at it. So what happened is, in this pandemic, and we have to give him the devil his due, and I will say the devil his due, with Operation Warp Speed. They did cut a lot of the red tape, and that's why a lot of the drugs, the drugs and the vaccines came through. But I want to give the due to the women who fought and stormed the doors, chained themselves on the to the courtrooms and all of that, and all fighting for the gay men who were dying of AIDS in the 80s.
There is a lot that's written and discussed about in the 70s, you know, to talk about kind of huge stereotypes. Lesbians and gay men were not in general in communities together. Lesbians were much more political in a huge, in a huge generalization, because as Bill pointed out, lesbians were also women who were suffering from sexism, not only. And so it was often said that when AIDS hit, lesbians were able to teach men political activism and political organizing, and men were able to teach art and beauty and culture and fashion. Okay.
Since this
There was
is
no sense that the communities were together before AIDS at all.
since this is being recorded, there's a woman named Muriel Moore who was at Holy Apostles, and no one really knows about her. She was on the vestry, and I was on the Mishkan committee. She was the one who came up to me, because I was at the church in '73, but it totally looked different, you know? It was like a dark brown wood sanctuary. So I didn't even remember that we started in that building. So she came up and she told us that, you know, CBST, you started, I was on, you know, and then she was the volunteer coordinator at the soup kitchen. So it was through Muriel that she would tell me, you got the whole story wrong. You keep on saying that you started in the daycare center. You were in the basement of the building next, so when every year I would say that to you, she was the one. And so we got so much of the history from Muriel Moore, and she's dead. Her name is on the white and black checkered stuff in the front, but so in 10 years, when anyone listens to this, they should know who Muriel Moore was.
Thank you so much. So the hour is late, and I just want to offer my deep gratitude to both of you. And this tableau is CBST, so thank you, both of you. What a beautiful, beautiful evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yes, incredible.
Thank you.